Welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the strange, silent places where history still lingers. Tonight, we turn not to wars or royalty, but to something quieter and more disturbing. A true crime, yes, but one that unfolded behind closed doors in a town where nothing was expected to go wrong. Le Mans, France, February 1933. In a town better known for its medieval cathedral and motorcar races, a single home on a cobbled street would become the site of a crime so brutal and so baffling that it would haunt French courts, philosophers, and newspapers. For decades, this is the story of Christine and Léa Papin, the maids who did not flee, who did not deny, and who offered no clear reason, except that something inside them had quietly broken the locked door on Rue Bruere. It was raining that evening, not heavily, just the steady kind of drizzle that soaked through collars and made the lamplight feel more distant than it should. The windows along Rue Bruere were fogged. Most homes had drawn their curtains tight against the cold, but at number 6, there was something else keeping the light out. The door was locked. René Lancelin, a retired solicitor, stood on the stone stoop holding a package in his gloved hand. His umbrella dripped at his feet. It was just past 7 p.m., and he had expected to find the household waiting. He was to collect his wife, Lenny, and their adult daughter, Genevieve. They were to attend a dinner at his brother-in-law's home, but no one came to the door. He knocked again, and again. No answer. Odd. His wife was punctual. The lights were on in the upper floors. He stepped back into the street and looked up. He saw the faint outline of the attic dormer window where the to-live-in maids, Christine and Léa Papin, slept. They'd been with the family for nearly 7 years. Quiet girls, hard-working. Christine, the elder, had a sharp tongue but a steady hand. Léa was younger, quieter, and followed her sister like a shadow. They rarely left the house, rarely took visitors. Their lives were lived in ironing, in errands, in the careful cleaning of silver and linens. It was unusual for them to leave the door unanswered. René walked around to the side gate, tested the back door. Also locked. The windows were dark, drawn. He called through the shutters. Still nothing. By 7:45, he was walking briskly toward the local police station. What followed, in official reports, was brief and clinical. A sergeant returned with him. 2 other constables joined. They forced open the front door. Inside, it was silent. The hallway floor was wet with muddy footprints, more than expected. One of the constables slipped on something that turned out to be a piece of porcelain, the lamp from the hallway table. Then came the discovery. Genevieve Lancelin's body lay in the hallway just outside the dining room. Her face was shattered. One eye socket caved in. Her skull was fractured so deeply that pieces of bone were embedded in the wallpaper. Her hands bore defensive wounds, deep cuts across the fingers. She had tried to shield herself and failed. Just beyond her, slumped against the dining table, was Madame Lenny Lancelin. Her body was partially covered by a blood-stained tablecloth. Her face was no more intact than her daughter's. Her legs were broken, her neck twisted. One of her eyes, like her daughter's, had been gouged out and placed in her open hand. On the floor were the weapons: a kitchen knife, the handle of a pewter pitcher, and a fire iron from the hearth. A single candlestick, bent and crusted with something dark, lay nearby, and above them, the house was quiet. The officers climbed the narrow stairs to the attic and found the door to the maids' quarters locked from within. They knocked. No answer. One of them called Christine's name. A voice, soft and even, responded, "Nous attendions." "We were waiting." They forced the door. Inside, they found both sisters in bed. They wore clean nightgowns. On the floor beside them were bloodied shoes, a basin of dark water, and a folded apron with crusted edges. The room smelled of iron and soap. Christine looked up at them, her face calm. "It was us," she said. "They were cruel, but it hadn't always been that way." To understand the events of that night, one has to step backward into the strange arrangement that was the Lancelin household, into the lives of 2 sisters who were always together, always quiet, and always watched except by the people who should have paid attention. Christine Papin was born in 1905, Léa in 1911. Their childhoods were marked by hardship. Their father was an alcoholic. their mother reportedly neglectful. Christine had been placed in a convent orphanage as a child, where she developed a love for religious order and a quiet obsession with duty. Lee, withdrawn and gentle, was often seen as simple, though later psychological reports would suggest she was not lacking intelligence, only identity. By the 1920s, the sisters were employed together wherever they could be kept in the same household. They insisted on it. Christine refused to work alone. When offered a better job without her sister, she declined. She said it was Lee who kept her calm. In 1926, they were hired by the Lancelin family in Le Mans. The arrangement was typical of the time, live-in domestic workers who handled cleaning, cooking, and errands. Their quarters were in the attic. They had little time off, no real privacy, but they were paid, clothed, and at least superficially respected. Still, tensions grew. Christine was frequently scolded by Madame Lancelin for failing to clean thoroughly enough or for serving cold meals. Lee, more obedient, stayed quiet, but Christine's temper flared. She once left a scorched pot on the stove for hours, refusing to replace it until she'd been formally asked. Small acts of passive resistance. In one note found after the murders, Christine had written, "If the lamp breaks, they will break us too. They always threatened to send us away." No one paid attention to the line. And then, on February 2nd, something did break. Later, Christine would say that she and Lee were ironing in the back room when the power shorted, something common in older homes. Christine went to the fuse box. She fixed it. But Madame Lancelin was angry that the outage had interrupted the ironing schedule. Words were exchanged. Christine said her mistress struck her. What happened next exactly remains uncertain, because once the violence began, it did not stop. Christine grabbed the pewter jug from the hallway table. Lee joined in with the fire iron. The women screamed. The maids screamed louder. Blows landed. Bones broke. Eyes were gouged. It went on for nearly 30 minutes. When the sisters were done, they dragged the bodies toward the dining room, cleaned the hallway, and retreated to their room. They did not run. They did not change clothes. They waited for Monsieur Lancelin to arrive. When he knocked, they said nothing. When the police entered, they confessed. They offered no plan, no escape, no remorse. The case that followed would grip France, not only because of its brutality but because of its ambiguity. There was no motive beyond insult, no history of crime, no theft, no betrayal, just two maids who had done their work until one night they didn't. And so the question hung in the courtroom and in cafes and in newspapers. What causes quiet girls to shatter the silence so completely? By the time Christine and Léa Papin were removed from their attic room and placed into separate cells at the Le Mans City Jail, the news had already begun to spread, not just through the stone alleys of the town, but through the long corridors of national interest. A double murder. To sisters, no escape, no mystery of who, only why. Reporters arrived from Paris within days. The house at 6 Rue Bruere became the subject of lurid headlines and speculative sketches. The crime had no obvious motive, no prior warning. The victims were not hated socialites. They were not corrupt politicians. They were a retired solicitor's wife and daughter. The kind of people no one notices until their absence is painted in blood. But it was the Papin sisters themselves who disturbed the country most. They did not cry. They did not collapse. Christine, older and more verbal, took responsibility immediately. She claimed that Madame Lancelin had treated them like animals and that years of abuse had finally broken something inside her. She described the events with a steady voice, never raising it. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply said it had been time. Lee said less, much less. She sat with her hands folded and eyes downcast, answering most questions with oui, non, or je ne sais pas. It was unclear, even to the authorities, how much she had actively participated. But it was Christine who insisted, "We did it together. I struck first, she finished it." The public struggled to comprehend this. Domestic workers were not expected to rebel, much less revolt with such fury. France's middle and upper classes had long relied on an unspoken arrangement with their servants, obedience in exchange for food, shelter, and the occasional kind word. Maids might steal silver, they might gossip, but murder, this kind of murder, belonged to another realm, something medieval, something primal. The sisters, however, seemed almost serene. They were examined by physicians, then psychiatrists, then more psychiatrists. At one point, a total of 8 separate mental health evaluations were conducted, each reaching different conclusions. Some declared Christine insane, others declared her lucid and calculating. Some described Lee as mentally retarded, a term used clinically at the time, while others insisted she was simply submissive, not unintelligent. One doctor proposed it wasn't just the violence that troubled the investigators, it was the intimacy. Christine and Lee had done everything together for years. They lived in the same room, ate every meal together, spoke almost exclusively to each other. Christine was dominant, Lee obedient. They walked in step, dressed similarly, shared a bed, even when they were offered separate ones. This closeness so intense, so insular, invited questions no one dared to say aloud. Were they simply sisters, or were they something else? The newspapers speculated wildly. Rumors spread of incest, of secret religious rites, of strange oaths, sworn in the attic at night. There was no evidence of any of it, but the public imagination filled in the blanks with its usual blend of fear and fascination. In prison, Christine grew agitated. She asked, repeatedly, to see Lee. When denied, she began tearing at her own skin. One night, guards found her clawing at her eyes, shouting, "I'll do to myself what I did to Madam." Doctors sedated her. After that, she quieted, but her mental state continued to degrade. By the time of the trial in September 1933, 7 months after the murders, Christine Papin was barely functioning, thin, pale, unblinking. Lee was brought in separately. She had gained weight, but said even less than before. The trial was held in Le Mans, but was attended by national figures, journalists, philosophers, social theorists. Among them was the young intellectual Jean-Paul Sartre, who would later reflect on the case as an example of the crushing power of social hierarchy and alienation. For some, the Papin sisters were not monsters, they were symptoms. The prosecution painted a different picture: too dangerous, deviant women who had hidden years of resentment behind their aprons, then exploded in rage. The courtroom was tense. Witnesses were called, neighbors, former employers, a few relatives. Most described the girls as odd, but not threatening. Madame Lancelin's cousin testified that she had warned Lenny years earlier that Christine was not like the others. Lay's former convent teacher recalled her as compliant, sweet, but vacant. No one could explain what had turned them violent, and so the jury was left with fragments. A locked house, 2 dead women, 2 maids upstairs, no theft, no escape, a confession with no remorse, motive that was, at best, unclear. On September 30th, 1933, the verdict came. Christine Papin was found guilty and sentenced to death by guillotine. Lee was found guilty as an accomplice and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. But there was more. Almost immediately, public outcry softened the punishment. Intellectuals signed petitions. Psychiatrists argued that Christine was deeply unwell. A few even claimed she had shown signs of epilepsy, hysteria, and religious psychosis, conditions poorly understood at the time. In March 1934, President Albert Lebrun commuted Christine's death sentence to life in prison. She was transferred to an asylum in Rennes. Lee, meanwhile, began her sentence. She worked in silence, spoke to no one. Her behavior was considered so docile that, after just 8 years, she was released for good behavior. In 1941, she disappeared from public view, lived under a new name. There are conflicting reports about her death. Some say she died in 1982. Others claim she was found alive in a nursing home in 2000. Blind and partially paralyzed, having lived under her sister's shadow for nearly a century. As for Christine, she did not survive long in prison. After several years of mental decline, she stopped eating. She died in 1937 of wasting illness. Doctors listed the cause as starvation, possibly self-induced. In the end, no one ever truly explained the Papin case. Not the philosophers, not the doctors, not the courts. It remains one of the most unsettling crimes in French history, less for what it was then for how ordinary everything seemed before it. To sisters, a household, a routine, and then something irreversible. The Lancelin house stood empty for years after the murders. Number 6, Rue Brueratol. Narrow structure of gray stone, and shuttered windows was too notorious to be resold, too unsettling to be torn down. Neighbors whispered about the silence inside. Children crossed the street to avoid its gate. The iron fence, once painted with care, flaked into rust. It was not haunted by spirits, but by memory, by the knowledge of what two quiet sisters had done upstairs while dinner cooled downstairs. Eventually, the building was repurposed quietly. A storage facility for the local library, then a registry office, but it never quite escaped the weight of its past. Even today, Le Mans residents of a certain age know the address. They remember the stories. Some still call it La Maison du Sang, the House of Blood. The murders of Madame Lenny Lancelin and her daughter Genevieve did not just scar one household. They cracked open a deep vein in French society, exposing tensions no one had wished to acknowledge. At first glance, the case seemed simple. Two maids killed their employers. It was brutal, yes, but in the age of headlines, brutality was not uncommon. What made this case echo for so long was its refusal to offer closure. Why did Christine and Léa Papin do what they did? There was no history of physical abuse, no theft, no affair, no betrayal. The sisters were not revolutionaries, nor known criminals. They had no political motive. They did not flee. They did not plead. When asked, Christine said only, "It was them or us." But what had changed? The answer, perhaps, lies not in a single moment, but in a quiet accumulation of tension, 1,000 small humiliations, never quite acknowledged, never quite soothed, the burden of invisible labor, of being looked at but not seen, spoken to but not heard. Christine Papin, by many accounts, had grown resentful over the years. Her complaints about Madame Lancelin's strictness, her annoyance at being spoken down to, her fury at being ordered, then scolded. These frustrations, according to one surviving letter, were never about cruelty in the dramatic sense, but about what Christine called the daily sharpening. Léa, meanwhile, absorbed Christine's moods like a sponge. She rarely initiated. She followed, always behind, always silent. Modern psychologists have studied the phenomenon now known as folie à shared delusion, or psychosis between two closely bonded individuals. In its extreme form, one dominant personality gradually imposes a worldview upon the other, until both inhabit a distorted reality together. Some believe that's what happened in Le Mans, that Christine, embittered, obsessive, and intensely dependent on her sister, created a closed psychological loop, that she projected all her frustrations onto the Lancelin women. Thus she shared that rage with Léa, not through words, but through daily rhythms, silent breakfasts, whispered complaints, a glance here, a scowl there. That eventually, Léa believed it too. And when the moment came when the fuse box sparked, and Madame raised her voice, it was as if a switch flipped. The horror of the attack itself confirmed the theory. It was not brief. It was not panicked. It was sustained, methodical. The sisters worked together, alternating blows. They mutilated the faces of the women they served. They removed the eyes. They arranged the bodies. And then, calmly, they returned to their room. To bed. To silence. The Papin sisters became icons in strange places. In the surrealist movement, they were embraced as symbols of revolt, feminine rage against bourgeois oppression. Artists like Jean Genet and Jean-Paul Sartre used their story to explore existential freedom and the rejection of roles assigned by class and gender. In philosophy seminars, they were discussed not as murderers, but as metaphors. What happens when a human being is seen only as a tool? What breaks when you are denied personhood? Day after day, until all that remains is shadow? Some embraced this interpretation, others rejected it. The families of the victims, understandably, wanted no part of abstract justifications. Their mother and sister were gone, their faces shattered. No theory could rebuild them. But the Papin case had already moved beyond facts. As the years passed, the sisters took separate paths. Léa Papin served 8 years of her sentence. She was released in 1941, changed her name, and took a job in a provincial hotel under the name Marie. She was known as a quiet, diligent cleaner. Those who worked with her said she never spoke of her past. She lived into her 70s, maybe even her 80s. There are conflicting reports. One 2000 documentary claimed she died in 1982. Another claimed she was found in 2000, blind and senile, living in hospice care in western France. She never spoke to the press. Christine, on the other hand, never truly recovered. Her obsession with Lee worsened in prison. When denied visits, she would scratch at her own face, scream into her pillow, refuse food. By 1937, her body had withered from malnutrition. Her death certificate listed cachexia, a wasting syndrome. She was 32. She was buried in a pauper's grave. No one claimed the body. And yet, the attic room where they lived is still remembered. Old blueprints show it was barely 10 feet wide, just enough room for 2 beds, a washstand, and a chest. No mirror, no heat, a single, narrow window, always fogged. They had no friends, no suitors. Their days began before dawn and ended after dark. In that space, the bond between them deepened into something the world could not understand. Something not entirely sisterhood, not quite romance, not just co-dependence. Something that, when broken, exploded in silence and steel. In recent years, the Papin case has a lens on class structure, a lens on invisible labor, a lens on how isolation distorts the mind. Their story has inspired plays, films, essays. But what remains most haunting is not what they did, but how they appeared before they did it. So ordinary, so quiet, so seemingly harmless. And maybe that's what frightens us most. That beneath the surface of routine and duty, there are depths we rarely see. And that sometimes, when no one's watching, they rise. In the end, the story of the Papin sisters leaves us not with answers, but with reflections. Who were they? Truly, victims of circumstance? Agents of chaos? A mirror for something unspoken in all of us? Their names have faded from popular memory, but their story lives on in court records, psychiatric journals, and most enduringly in the question that still lingers behind every locked attic door. What lives in silence until it breaks? The snow had begun falling sometime after sunset, light and dry, the kind that doesn't stick right away, just dusts the ground like flour on an old wooden table. Inside the parlor at St. Anselm's Rectory, the fire was lit and supper was being cleared. The bishop, Reverend Thomas Fletcher, was speaking gently about the parish's winter offerings, unaware that his wife had been missing for nearly 20 minutes. Her name was Emily Fletcher, born Emily Ward before her marriage. She was the daughter of a respected banker from Lincolnshire, known for her needlework, her quiet demeanor, and her unwavering presence beside her husband's ministry. She was the kind of woman people forgot to notice until she wasn't there. The dinner had been modest roast duck, potatoes, stewed apples, and a heavy white pudding served with brandy butter. Seated at the table were the bishop, 2 visiting clergymen from Norwich, a schoolmistress from the nearby village, and Emily. She had smiled politely, passed the wine, and excused herself just before the second round of tea, saying she would retrieve a bottle of elderflower cordial from the kitchen. She never returned. At first, no one noticed. The men spoke of the bishop's recent sermon on the Epistle of James. The schoolmistress commented on the early freeze that year. It wasn't until one of the clergymen remarked how quiet the house seemed without Emily's gentle footsteps that her absence was realized. The bishop sent a footman to the kitchen, then to the cellar, then upstairs. Within 15 minutes, the guests were standing in the hallway, coats pulled over shoulders, the servants searching room by room. The back door was still bolted. The front door had not been opened. Her shawl remained on the hook. Her gloves were still in the dining room. Her boots were dry. They called her name, first softly, then louder. They searched the kitchen, the scullery, the drawing room, the upstairs bedrooms, even the winter garden. Emily Fletcher was gone. By morning, word had spread through the village of North Reps, a handful of locals, farmhands, a carpenter. The vicar's curate gathered at the rectory to assist. The bishop remained composed, but pale. His voice was calm, but the servants noted how he twisted the chain of his pocket watch over and over until it left an imprint in his palm. The local constable arrived by horseback before noon. a mild man named Caleb Hurst. He wore a wool overcoat to sizes too large and carried a wooden truncheon he never used. He began his inquiries methodically. Every room was inspected. Every window latch tested. Doors opened and closed again. The snow outside was nearly an inch deep by then. There were no footprints, no disturbed paths, no broken locks, no sign of forced entry. Emily had, by all accounts, simply disappeared. The first theory was medical. Perhaps she had fainted, wandered in confusion. The bishop recalled that she had been feeling unwell the week prior. She had spoken of headaches, a tightness in her chest. Could she have suffered a seizure, a fit of amnesia? But if so, where had she gone? The entire house was stone, the walls thick, the grounds bordered by a hedge and an iron gate that creaked loudly when opened. No one had seen or heard a thing. The bishop's housekeeper, Mrs. Kingsley, reported that nothing was missing from the larder. No candle was removed from the storage bin. The cellar was untouched. Emily's boots were still in the vestibule, neatly placed beneath the bench. Constable Hurst made notes in a leather book. He scribbled the phrase "voluntary departure" beside a question mark. But why would she leave? And how, with no coat, no shoes, and no trace in the fresh snow? By the end of the second day, the case had moved beyond a household concern. Word reached the local magistrate in Cromer, who dispatched 2 investigators. They questioned the staff, interviewed the bishop twice, searched the grounds, including the well, the orchard, and the small potting shed. Nothing. On the third day, search parties combed the village. Children were sent to check under bridges, behind millstones, even in the hedgerows where birds sometimes nested low in the frost. A neighbor offered his sheepdog. The beast sniffed at Emily's gloves, circled the gate, and lay down in the snow. The bishop, under pressure from the church and local authorities, offered a reward, £20 for any information leading to his wife's whereabouts. That no one came forward. Whispers, however, did begin to emerge. A maid, Agnes Hall, 17, recently hired, confided to another servant that she had once seen Emily standing in the garden, near the orchard, staring into the woods for nearly half an hour, not moving, not speaking. When Agnes called to her, she turned slowly, smiled, and said, "Sometimes the silence tells me things." Another housemaid claimed she had overheard the bishop and his wife arguing nights before her disappearance. Something about a letter, something about someone named E. She couldn't hear the rest. Still others mentioned Emily's increasing distance, that she walked alone more often, that her reading had changed from prayer books to novels, that she had stopped attending services at the bishop's side, choosing instead to sit at the back of the church, that she no longer sang during hymns. All small things, but in the vacuum of answers, small things take on weight. On the 6th day, a letter arrived at the rectory. It was addressed simply to the bishop, personal. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar, the ink slightly smudged by moisture. Inside, a single sentence: "You always did like your answers clean. This one will not be." There was no signature. The bishop showed the letter to the constable. It was held as evidence. But nothing further arrived. The following week, a rumor reached Cromer that a woman matching Emily's description had been seen boarding a train in King's Lynn, traveling alone, wearing a gray cloak. But when the manifest was checked, no ticket matched her name, and no one had spoken to her. By January, the snow had hardened into ice. The hedges stood bare. The bishop returned to his duties. The staff resumed their work. The door to Emily's sitting room was kept shut. The newspapers printed a short column in the Norfolk Chronicle under the heading, "Wife of Churchman Still Missing. No leads in Northrup's disappearance." Her family, distant, formal, and embarrassed, did not press for an inquest. They simply said Emily was always a little difficult to understand. And then, 3 months later, something surfaced. But it wasn't Emily. It was April when the gardener found it. The earth behind the potting shed had softened with the thaw, and Richard Gage, a local boy hired to turn the soil for spring bulbs, had been clearing the moss from under the eaves. As he scraped away a patch of decayed leaf matter, his trowel struck something hard, flat, and metallic. He brushed away the dirt to reveal a small tin box, the kind used for biscuits or sewing supplies. Its hinges were rusted, but not fully seized. Inside, wrapped in wax paper and bound with twine, was a folded piece of linen parchment. Upon it, in faded brown ink, were 9 lines of text. No greeting, no date, no signature. It read, "The rooms are to quiet when you leave them. The wine tastes like water. The snow keeps your secrets. I hear my own voice when you pray, and I will not be forgiven for the things you refuse to remember." The handwriting was later confirmed by 2 clerics who had seen her correspondence, and one of the housemaids who handled her letters as Emily Fletcher's. The letter caused immediate unease in the bishop's household. It was handed first to the housekeeper, then to the bishop, then delivered via coach to the Cromer magistrate. Speculation began at once. Was this a confession, a farewell, a poem? The lines were opaque, unsettling, and offered little in the way of clarity. Constable Hurst returned to the rectory and requested a second full search of the house. This time, with the bishop's cautious consent, floorboards were lifted in the attic and shelves removed from closets. Dust was shaken from hymnals. A section of wallpaper behind Emily's writing desk was peeled back. They found nothing new. Yet the letter's discovery shifted the tone of the case. If Emily had written those words, it meant she had premeditated something, a disappearance, a symbolic act. The bishop insisted that his wife had always enjoyed writing verses, and that she was deeply spiritual, sometimes obscure in expression. He denied knowledge of any intent to leave or harm herself. But the line, "I will not be forgiven for the things you refuse to remember," lingered. Some began to whisper that it wasn't Emily who had forgotten something, that the bishop, perhaps, had a past more complicated than his title suggested. Over the following weeks, 2 new details surfaced. The first came from an elderly laundress named Mrs. Webb, who had worked part-time at the rectory for over 2 decades. She told the curate that in the spring of 1848, 6 years earlier, Emily had suffered what she described as a terrible bleeding. Not a miscarriage, she clarified, but a violent episode that required a doctor from Norwich. The bishop, she claimed, forbade anyone from speaking of it. The doctor had been a young man named Harold Kitson, who had since moved to Glasgow. A letter was sent. His reply was brief, professional, and non-committal. He recalled attending to Mrs. Fletcher during a period of what he termed extreme nervous exhaustion, and denied that any physical trauma had occurred. The second detail came from the records of the Northrop station master. It showed that on the night of Emily's disappearance, no train had passed through. However, a small maintenance cart had been taken down the tracks toward the junction used occasionally by workers for equipment or mail. The name recorded beside the dispatch time 10:40 p.m. was E. Carter. There was no E. Carter in the employ of the railway company. The initials were never connected to any local person, but E. was the same letter overheard in the housemaid's account of the bishop, and Emily's argument 2 nights before she vanished. Or still, it wasn't proof. It wasn't even a lead. Just another hollow pocket in the story, echoing with unanswered questions. Public interest waned. By summer, the village had accepted the event as a curiosity best left behind. The bishop resumed his duties, though with a more somber manner. He no longer dined with guests. The elderflower cordial remained unopened on the kitchen shelf. Then, on the first Sunday of August, during a particularly warm service, a small commotion arose in the second pew. A woman, pale, frail, wearing a veil, collapsed. She had arrived late, seated herself alone, and said nothing. When she fainted, the parishioners gathered to assist. But by the time they unpinned her veil, she had recovered enough to whisper, "Please don't." No one recognized her. When offered water, she declined. She rose, trembling, and walked calmly from the church. One boy claimed she limped. Another said she walked as if she'd lived in that building her whole life. She was never seen again. The bishop never mentioned the incident. When asked later, he said simply, "Many people resemble one another. Grief plays strange tricks." The years passed. Emily Fletcher was declared legally deceased in 1862, 8 years after her disappearance. Her husband remained at St. Anselm's until his retirement in 1871. He died 2 years later, reportedly in his sleep. His final diary entry, written in shaky ink and dated May 3, 1873, Read, I hear her sometimes when the windows are open, not in voice, but in the silence that follows the chimes. What truly happened to Emily Fletcher remains unknown. There was no body, no confession, only a letter under the soil, a name on a rail manifest, and a memory that refused to fade. Some believed she ran away. Some believed she died and was hidden. Others believed she had never left at all, that her spirit remained in the house, quiet. As always. By the time the rectory was emptied in 1874, few people in North Reps still remembered the dinner where Emily Fletcher had stood, excused herself with a soft smile, and disappeared into history. The furniture was sold at modest auction. The heavy curtains were removed, revealing windows that hadn't opened in decades. When the attic was cleared, they found two trunks. One belonged to the bishop, the other to Emily. Hers contained little of surprise: a sachet of lavender, several prayer cards, hand-inked with scripture, a worn copy of the Imitation of Christ with water stains along the spine, a stack of personal letters tied in green ribbon. But beneath the letters, at the very bottom of the trunk, was a small black notebook, leather-bound, unlabeled. Inside were 9 entries, all written in the same narrow, slanted hand, dated sporadically between 1850 and 1854, the final one written just 5 days before her disappearance. They weren't diary entries, not quite, more like meditations, private thoughts folded between scripture, glimpses of dreams, flashes of resentment. They spoke of duty, of fading color, of silence. Mostly one passage stood out, circled in ink: to disappear is not to die, it is to be freed from the definitions of others. I am more than what I serve. No conclusion, no explanation, only that. When the notebook was presented to the Diocesan Archive in Norwich, it was filed under personal papers, Fletcher Estate. It was never published, not suppressed, just quietly shelved, much like the story itself. Yet even decades later, the story clung to the village. In 1892, a boy walking through the old orchard claimed to have seen a woman in gray watching him from beneath the hedgerow. She said nothing. He turned to run. When he looked back, she was gone. In 1901, a visiting historian researching clerical records was offered a room at the rectory, now maintained as a lodging house. She reported in her journal that the room felt unusually quiet, as if every sound I made had to pass through gauze before it reached the air. She did not sleep that night. The following morning, she requested a different room. In 1936, the rectory was sold. The new owners renovated the upper floor, removed a section of wall, and discovered a niche, a narrow hollow built into the brick. Inside was a single glove, women's size, worn at the fingertips. No one could prove it was Emily's. No one could explain why it was hidden. What becomes of a person when their story has no ending? In historical records, they become a gap, a footnote, a small line beneath the marriage date, presumed dead. But in memory, they linger differently. The people of North Reps, especially the older generation, still speak of her now and then. Not often, only when snow begins to fall in thin, dry sheets, or when the bishop's garden blooms without being tended. Some say the elderflower bush near the back shed never stopped growing. Even in the harshest winters, it survived. Others say the house never fully warmed again. That one corner of the kitchen always stayed cold, no matter how many times the hearth was relit. Several modern historians have examined the case. Some argue that Emily Fletcher, like other Victorian women who suffered mental strain, likely had no path to autonomy except disappearance, that she may have planned her vanishing for months, that she found a way through the rail line, through disguise, through careful timing to escape, to begin again. Others insist the story is darker, that secrets were kept, that the bishop may not have been as spotless as the records suggest, that silence was not merely Emily's, it was institutional. There were no charges, no inquest, only dignified quiet. The church never reopened the case still. Others point to her writings, not just her final letter or the notebook, but those who knew her, her distaste for public gatherings, her shifts in mood, her long, fixed stares into trees and glass. That line she once said to the housemaid, "Sometimes the silence tells me things." It was not a cry for help. It was a philosophy. The story of Emily Fletcher is not one of death. It is one of vanishing dot of how a life can become a vapor trail across stone walls and dinner tables. How even in a world of watches, ledgers, footmen, and timetables a person could still step sideways and not be found. And in the absence of certainty, we are left with questions that do not fade, but settle like dust, like snow, like the quiet that follows a prayer.